and you're worried if you're running the American operation. You're very, very worried about what global public opinion is going to think. So what you start doing is pushing out propaganda. And what they're trying to say in this long, long sequence of propaganda stories is the reason we're going into Fallujah is because Al-Qaeda are there. And the reason we know Al-Qaeda are there is because Zarqawi is there. Do you remember Abu Musab al-Zarqawi was presented to us as the leader of Al-Qaeda? Almost everything we were told about Zarqawi, gone into this in great detail in the book, almost all the Zarqawi story is fiction, produced by this propaganda industry to generate the idea that the people they're fighting in America are Al-Qaeda and not the people of Iraq. And so as they're going into Fallujah, they kept pumping out these ludicrous stories about Zarqawi. I'll just read you this first couple of lines off the Melbourne Age story and see whether you can see anything in this story that should have alerted the people who've written it that it just might not be true. Okay. US troops sweeping through Fallujah today said they believe they found a training center for the Al-Qaeda group headed by Jordanian terrorist Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. Soldiers walked through one imposing building with concrete columns with a large sign in Arabic on the wall reading, Al-Qaeda Organization. This is the most hunted group in the world. And it's like, McDonald's, Woolworths, Al-Qaeda, come and get it. This is mad, the concrete columns. This is mad. But there it is, running around the world, because propaganda and journalism, it's easy. We don't check. We don't do our jobs anymore. OK, so just moving on. This is still on this rather long loop about objectivity. After our basic failure to make these selective judgments, or even to recognize that they need to be made, we get sucked into the consensus. After the impact of PR, selecting true stories for us, after the impact of propaganda, there's then just a bunch of kind of logistical pressures which work away on newsrooms and usurp these selective judgments for us. So one of these is what I call Ninja Turtle syndrome. And this is basically about the compulsion that news desks and reporters feel to cover the stories that everybody else is covering. And the idea of Ninja Turtle syndrome, that expression goes back to when I had young children during the 1980s, and there was this obnoxious American television program on with these horrible little reptiles with squeaky voices and high-velocity rifles or whatever running around the place. And apart from the fact that they were clearly psychopathically violent, what was really objectionable was they were all named after Renaissance artists. So you had a generation of children growing up thinking that Leonardo and Raphael are these heavily armed reptiles. So as a parent, you say to yourself, well, that's okay. When that crap's on the television, we just won't have it on. And we won't buy the nasty little plastic knickknacks from the shop. We will have a turtle-free home. And all is fine until the kids go into the playground at school and every other child is talking turtle. And they come back and say, we're left out. We can't talk turtle. We can't swap turtles. We're buggered socially. So you say, oh, all right, we'll have to give in. Watch it a bit so you can talk turtle and get a few things from the shop. So you get sucked in. And the same thing happens on news desks. Up pop stories, and news desks say, this story is obviously not true, and/or this story is clearly too trivial to be run. But if everybody else is running it, we're going to have to do it. Otherwise, our punters will be down at the pub, and they won't know what everybody else is talking about. And that's very bad for us, commercially speaking, because they'll buy the other newspapers so that they can join in the big conversation. And there's masses of examples. There's a constant pressure. It happens very much with trivial stories. You watch quality newspapers desperately struggling to avoid covering something like all that bullshit about Paris Hilton being in and out of prison. Who gives a damn? I'm afraid commercially we do. If that's what they're talking down the pub, we're going to have to run that crap, even the most quality newspapers, because we dare not be left out. Have I got enough time to tell you an example? Yeah. So, the example of this that I use in the book that I quite like is a few years ago when the Mail on Sunday splashed on a story which said that an unnamed member of the royal family had been having some kind of sexual affair with a senior palace servant. And within about 48 hours, it became clear that what they were talking about was Prince Charles having an affair with a guy called Michael Fawcett, a sort of chubby chap in a pinstripe suit, who works at Buckingham Palace. And any news desk in the country sat back and looked at that and said, well, hang on, what do we know about this story? What are the sources that suggest that this story might be true? And there were three. First of all, there was Prince Charles. And as soon as he was identified, he put out a passionate denial. The whole story's untrue. And what we know about Charles is that years back, he did have a history of some promiscuity, but always with women, not with chubby chaps in pinstripe suits. So that's quite a compelling denial and gives us no source at all for the story. Source number two is Michael Fawcett, he with the pinstripe suit. He also, as soon as he's identified, puts out a passionate denial. So we've got no evidence at all to support the story there. Well, then there was a third source, a guy called George Smith, who had worked as a footman at Buckingham Palace. And what do we know about George? We know that years earlier, he had a conversation with Princess Diana, which so disturbed her that she tape recorded it. And a year or two before this story that I'm talking about, another part of that tape recording had surfaced in the newspapers. And in this earlier story, George Smith had said, I was on a royal visit to Egypt with Prince Charles. During the night, while I was asleep in my room, Michael Fawcett, presumably a chubby chap in pyjamas and not pinstripe suit on this occasion, came into my bedroom and raped me. Now, that was such a serious allegation that was made public at that time that the police were called in to investigate it, and they found out various things about George. One was that he had a really significant problem with alcohol. The second was that he'd been repeatedly sectioned under the Mental Health Act. And the third was that he'd never been to Egypt. Right. So the news desk sit back and they look at the sources for this story. There's Prince Charles, nothing there. There's Michael Fawcett, nothing there. And there's George Smith, a man who, whether through malice or madness, invents stories about the sexual behavior of Michael Fawcett. Can we run this story? No. Do we run it? Of course we do. Ninja Turtle. Everybody else is running it. We can't say no. So there's this invisible pressure that's taking over these selective judgments that we should be making. And there's another one which is separate from that, but but slightly similar, but in a way almost worse, which is when some stories provoke a sort of moral panic in the nation, and we are compelled, A, to cover them, and B, to cover them with a preordained angle. So you get this at times of war. It's any time of heightened national emotion. War does it. Once our boys go into fight, we are always on their side. And no matter what they do, they are good. So there was a friend of mine who was covering the Falklands conflict all those years ago, who had hard evidence while the fighting was going on that British troops were shooting dead, unarmed Argentinian prisoners of war. They were murdering them. And they would not let him put out the story because our boys are fighting. Don't you understand? We're at war. And the answer, of course, is, don't you understand? We're supposed to be reporters. Do you remember that funny old business about the truth? Preordained angle. Our boys are good. Our cause is good. And I mean, it's very, very, very rare to find a news organization that will break out of that preordained moral panic angle. Apart from war, you also get it with big deaths. There was all sorts of wonderful moral panic stuff. Well, the deaths of popes produces it. The death of the Queen Mother was a wonderful example. She was a very frightening character because she just refused to die. She went on to be about 101, didn't she? And the longer she lived, the more obituary material was prepared. And so it was always very worrying if you had a long story going into the paper or a special thing going out on World in Action or something, that if the old lady dies tonight, there's going to be this tsunami of obituary material which will just crash my story out of the paper. Well, rather maliciously, you may think, she went and died on a Saturday, which cheated all the daily papers of the big, big tale. So the Sundays went for it. And because of moral panic, they took this preordained angle. So if you look back at the Observer coverage, there you'll see this relatively left of centre, supposedly not particularly royalist newspaper, that throughout its entire front page and the following 10 pages of that big old news section, it all went, all those stories. The selective judgment about what we're covering was completely usurped by moral panic. All of those pages were filled with stories about the Queen Mother, and the angle that was taken was preordained. It was full of royalist guff, some of it clearly fiction. There was a headline across the top of pages 2 and 3 that said something like, "Millions grieve as old lady in hat dies." And it just wasn't true. You know, she was a nice enough old lady. She'd had a bit of a rub-in with the fascists in the 1930s who she tended to support, but never mind, you know, she's dead, that's fair enough. But not millions grieving. There was a real shortage of grief. Never mind, we'll make it up. We've got a moral panic angle. Terribly difficult problem for television, because on the Sunday morning, all the camera crews are sent down to, it's called Clarence House, isn't it, on the Mall, just up from Buckingham Palace where she'd lived. And the preordained moral panic angle is the Diana story, the sea of bouquets and the weeping crowds, the nation in grief. And they get down there, there's nobody there. There's just like 4 or 5 spindly little roses in front of the gates, and you can bet they were bought by photographers. And so they're hanging around, where's our story? We've got to find our story. And there was this one woman who suddenly became the most famous woman in Britain. She was mixed race, late 30s, and she was crying within a 1-mile radius of Clarence House, and they leapt. So there it is, the nation's mourning. On the Saturday evening, there were these terrible problems. There was a crew sent down to the West End. The preordained moral panic angle is, because the nation's mourning, the West End is quiet. Everybody's out there. Well, of course, they arrived down there with their camera crew. Everybody's out there getting drunk, making passes, vomiting, hitting each other in the normal way. So the reporter, he knows he can't go giving the game away, so he came up with this great line. He stood facing the camera with his back to all this chaos and said, "It was the spirit of the Blitz in the West End tonight. The old lady's dead, but the show must go on. The courage of a nation at grief." So do you see these things come in, masquerading as objectivity taking over. And the other thing that's always in there are just the kind of logistical pressures of choosing to cover the easy story, the cheap story. The one that's in London is much more likely to be covered than the one that's in the provinces. This is where PR comes in. They manufacture stories which are very, very cheap and easy and safe to cover. So they're very attractive. I could go on about that a bit more, but I'm running out of time. So